The clang of machinery echoed through the dingy factory, its oppressive noise drowning out any attempt at thought. Jamie Cole stood at his workstation, mechanically performing his tasks, while the voices of his co-workers rang louder than the machines. They weren't talking to him, not directly, no. They preferred their cruelty in the form of jabs tossed across the room, thinly veiled insults wrapped in laughter. "Hey, Jamie, got any fancy words for us today?" Tom, the loudest and cruelest of them all, called out, leaning against his station with a smug grin. "Or are you too good to talk to us lowly folk?" Jamie's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, trying to focus on the monotonous task in front of him. Every day was the same. His formal way of speaking had set him apart since he started here, and now it was like a target had been painted on his back. To them, he was a joke, a rich kid pretending to be better than the rest. But they didn't know him. They didn't know how stuck he felt, how trapped he was in a life that had long ago become a prison. Tom wasn't done. Must be tough, huh? All that fancy talk and still working here with the rest of us. What a waste. The laughter stung, but what hurt more was the truth behind the words. Jamie could feel the walls of the factory closing in on him, the noise of the machines fusing with the mocking voices until it was all he could hear. His chest tightened, and the need to escape overwhelmed him. He couldn't take another minute in this place. During lunch break, Jamie found a quiet corner by the grimy window overlooking the street. The sun filtered through the dirt, casting the world outside in a hazy glow. He stared at it, thinking of how small his life had become. Every day, the same routine, the same taunts. Every night, the same feelings of failure, of being stuck in a world that didn't want him. It was all too much. He needed to escape, needed something, anything, to change. When Tom passed by, giving Jamie a final sneer, it was the last straw. Jamie didn't wait for the end of his shift. He ripped off his work gloves, shoved them into his locker, and left the factory. The streets felt too big and empty, the noise of the world around him too distant, but he didn't stop walking. He wasn't sure where he was going, he just knew he couldn't go back. Jamie walked for hours, his mind numb and his body running on autopilot. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the city streets, but still, he wandered. His feet carried him to a part of the city he had never been before, quiet, forgotten, with tall, crumbling buildings that seemed to lean in on him like the factory walls. That's when he saw it. A glowing sign, standing out against the gloom like a beacon. Free personality test. Are you curious about yourself? Come in. Above it, in large ornate letters, were the words "The Church of Eternal Light." Gothic spires stretched toward the darkening sky, and despite the eerie aura of the place, something about it drew Jamie in. He hesitated, hearing the warnings in his mind, the stories he'd heard about places like this. Cults, manipulation, traps for people like him, vulnerable, desperate for answers. But still, he felt the pull. The sign promised understanding, and right now, that's what he craved most. Without thinking, Jamie pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The atmosphere changed instantly. The air was warm, scented with incense that clung to the walls, and a soothing hum of music filled the space. It was peaceful, serene, and the chaos of the outside world faded away. For the first time all day, Jamie felt something other than despair. He felt calm. "Welcome," came a smooth voice from behind him. Jamie turned to see a man approaching, tall and composed, with a warm smile and piercing green eyes that seemed to look right through him. "My name is Alan. How can I help you?" Jamie stammered, unsure of how to explain why he had come. I saw the sign," he managed, his voice shaky. "I'm curious about the personality test." Alan's smile widened, and he gestured for Jamie to follow. "Of course. You're in the right place. We'll help you discover things about yourself you never imagined. Come, let's begin." Alan led Jamie down a long corridor, lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes seeming to follow his every movement. The hall ended at a small, dimly lit room, where a single desk and chair waited. Symbols, strange, twisting marks that Jamie didn't recognize, were etched into the walls, giving the room a strange, otherworldly feeling. Alan motioned to the desk. "The test is simple, but it's important that you answer every question honestly. Take your time." This is about discovering your true self. Jamie sat, his fingers trembling slightly as Alan placed a thick stack of papers in front of him. The first question was simple enough. How do you feel about your current life? Jamie frowned. It seemed innocent, but there was a weight to the question that made him pause. He answered, though, and moved on to the next. What are you most afraid of? When did you last feel truly alone? The questions grew more probing, digging into his fears, his regrets, his insecurities. As the minutes turned to hours, Jamie felt like the test was peeling back layers of his mind, exposing parts of himself he had kept hidden for so long. It was exhausting, and yet, there was a strange relief in it. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there when Alan reappeared. "You've done well," Alan said, his voice soft but commanding. "The test will take some time to process. In the meantime, let me show you something that might help you understand the process." Alan led Jamie to a small, private cinema, far more luxurious than he had expected. Rich velvet seats, a massive screen, and soft lighting gave the room a surreal, dreamlike quality. Jamie sat in the front row, alone, as the lights dimmed and the film began. At first, it seemed harmless. Scenes of ordinary life played out before him, people eating dinner, children playing, but soon, the images shifted. Grotesque figures flickered in the background, their eyes hollow and watching. Strange symbols, like the ones on the walls of the church, flashed across the screen, and shadowy creatures slithered between scenes of domestic normalcy. It was unsettling, but Jamie couldn't look away. The narrator spoke in a low, steady voice. "The things that haunt you today were planted long ago. Trauma shapes us in ways we do not understand. Events from your past still control your present." Jamie felt his chest tighten as the images morphed into something darker, visions of his own life, his failures, his isolation, mixed with the disturbing figures from the film. It was as if the movie was speaking directly to him, unraveling his past and showing him the chains that still held him down. When the film ended, Jamie sat in stunned silence. He didn't notice Alan approaching until he was standing beside him. "That was something, wasn't it?" Alan's voice was calm, but his eyes glittered with something Jamie couldn't place. "Yes," Jamie whispered. "It felt personal." Alan smiled. "Because it is. Now, let's discuss your results." Alan led Jamie to his office, a richly decorated room filled with ancient-looking books and strange artifacts. The air here was thicker, heavier, and Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something powerful lingered in the space. Alan sat behind his large mahogany desk and gestured for Jamie to sit across from him. "You've carried a heavy burden for a long time," Alan began, his voice soothing but firm. "Your test results show that you're not just unhappy, Jamie. You're cursed. This curse has followed you since before you were born, shaping every part of your life, your pain, your isolation, your fear." Jamie blinked, stunned. "Cursed?" Alan nodded. "But it's not hopeless. We can help you, but it will take time and commitment. You'll need to go through a series of rituals that will sever the ties to this darkness. It's the only way to free yourself." Jamie's mind swirled with confusion, but there was something comforting in Alan's words. He wanted to believe him. "Rituals?" "Yes," Alan said, his voice growing softer, almost hypnotic. "But they will work. I promise you that. You're special, Jamie. You're meant for more than this pain." Jamie swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the weight of everything. A curse? Rituals? It was insane, but if it could help, if it could finally free him from the misery of his life. "I'll do it," Jamie said quietly. "I'll come back." Alan smiled, his eyes gleaming. "Good. You've taken the first step toward salvation." Jamie sat alone in the cold, dimly lit basement of the Church of Eternal Light. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, his body still reeling from the strange chanting that had surrounded him moments ago. The ritual had ended, but the echo of the rhythmic voices still reverberated in his ears, as if they lingered in the very air of the room. He blinked against the haze of exhaustion that had settled over him, trying to piece together his thoughts. Alan's presence loomed in the doorway, and though Jamie had just undergone something he couldn't yet explain, there was a hollow comfort in seeing him. "Well done, Jamie," Alan said softly, stepping into the room with measured steps. His voice was warm, soothing, but there was an edge to it, a hint of anticipation. "This is just the beginning. You'll start to feel the darkness lifting soon." Jamie glanced up, feeling the weight of those words sink into him. The darkness, had it really been inside him all along? He wanted to believe that what he had just experienced was the first step toward freedom, but a nagging unease gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Alan reached into his pocket and produced a small medallion, its surface engraved with intricate, unfamiliar symbols. He placed it in Jamie's hand, and the cold metal seemed to pulse faintly under his touch. "Wear this at all times," Alan instructed. "It will protect you during the process. The rituals work even after you leave this place." Jamie nodded, still feeling a disorientation he couldn't quite shake. The medallion was heavy, its weight almost symbolic of the burden he hoped to shed. But even as he stood to leave, a lingering discomfort trailed him, like a shadow he couldn't escape. Alan's words soothed him, but underneath the surface, something felt wrong. "I'll be ready for the next one," Jamie murmured, more to reassure himself than Alan. With that, Jamie left the church, stepping out into the cool night air. The world outside seemed distant, hazy, as if he were viewing it through a fog. His thoughts were scattered, but there was one certainty left in him: the rituals were the only way out. He just had to keep going. The next morning, Jamie woke in a panic. The sun was already high in the sky, casting rays of light across his bedroom. He shot up in bed, heart pounding, as he realized it was late afternoon. He couldn't remember how he had gotten home last night, and worse, there was a strange gap in his memory, like time had slipped away from him. He groaned, rubbing his face, and felt the cool weight of the medallion still around his neck. It was there, solid and real, but everything else felt surreal. As his eyes adjusted to the daylight, something else caught his attention: the walls of his bedroom. The symbols from his vision the night before, the ones etched into the walls of the church, seemed to shimmer faintly on the surface of his bedroom walls. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the longer he stared, the clearer they became. Dark lines, barely visible in the morning light, twisting and curling in patterns that shouldn't have been there. A cold sweat formed on his brow. Shaking off the eerie feeling, Jamie grabbed his phone and saw several missed calls and a string of worried texts from Rebecca. "Jamie, are you okay? You disappeared last night. Call me back." Feeling guilty for not answering, he dialed her number. The phone rang only once before she picked up. "Jamie, where the hell have you been?" Rebecca's voice was sharp, but underneath was a tone of deep concern. "I'm sorry," Jamie muttered, his voice groggy. I don't remember much about last night. I've just been tired from work, I guess. Are you sure you're okay? You sound off." Her words carried a weight that made Jamie shift uncomfortably. He didn't want to talk about the church, not yet. Not until he understood what was happening to him. "I'm fine," he said quickly. "Let's meet up. We can talk then." After a pause, Rebecca agreed, but her suspicion was clear. Jamie hung up, feeling the strangeness of the previous night cling to him like a second skin. The symbols on the walls were fading in the daylight, but the memory of them refused to leave. He pushed the thought away, more focused now on the next ritual than on the creeping dread in his gut. The cafe was quiet when Jamie arrived. Rebecca sat at a small table in the corner, nursing a coffee as she looked up at him with a frown. Jamie slid into the seat across from her, feeling the weight of the medallion still around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. "Jamie," she started, her eyes scanning his face. "You look tired. More than usual." "I've just had a lot on my mind," he said, brushing off the comment. He didn't want to dive into the details of the rituals, not yet. "Work's been stressful." She didn't seem convinced. Her gaze sharpened as she leaned forward. "This is more than work, Jamie. You've been acting different for weeks. What's going on?" For a moment, Jamie hesitated. He considered telling her about the church, about Alan and the rituals, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to explain something he barely understood himself. "I've been going to this place," he began, his voice low. "It's helping me, I think. It's called the Church of Eternal Light." Rebecca's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "The Church of Eternal Light? Jamie, no. I've read about them. They're not just some harmless spiritual group. There's something really dark about what they do. I'm fine, Rebecca, he insisted, trying to push down the flicker of doubt her words sparked. It's helping. I feel like I'm finally doing something about everything. She looked at him with disbelief. You're not seeing what's happening to you. Something about this feels wrong, Jamie. Please, stop going. It's not too late. Jamie felt a surge of irritation, something he wasn't used to feeling toward Rebecca. He didn't need her to understand, he just needed the rituals to work. You don't get it, he said, more sharply than he intended. This is the only thing that's made sense in a long time. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I've got to go. Rebecca looked hurt, but he couldn't stay. The pull to return to the church was growing stronger, louder, like a voice calling him back. Without another word, Jamie left the cafe, walking faster than necessary, his mind fixated on the next ritual. The familiar scent of incense greeted Jamie as he stepped into the church. Alan was waiting for him, his smile calm, almost serene. Jamie, Alan greeted. Are you ready for the next step? Jamie nodded, feeling the tension in his chest loosen slightly. The rituals, whatever they were, had become his only anchor. Alan guided him down the now familiar corridor and into the ritual chamber, the room darker than before, lit only by flickering candlelight. This ritual is about deprivation, Alan explained as he led Jamie into a smaller, windowless room. You'll be left alone with only your thoughts, your senses dulled. It's meant to help you confront the darkness inside. Jamie felt a slight tremor of fear but swallowed it down. He trusted Alan. He trusted the process. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud, and soon, Jamie was plunged into silence. The air was thick, the only sound the slow drip of water somewhere in the distance. He sat in the darkness, waiting. Time became meaningless as the hours stretched on, the silence pressing in on him. Then the hallucinations began. At first, it was small, faint movements in the shadows, a sense of being watched. But the longer Jamie sat, the more intense it became. He could see figures now, tall, cloaked beings, their faces hidden, watching him from the edges of the room. Whispers filled the air, in a language Jamie didn't understand, but it felt like they were speaking to him, drawing him closer to something ancient, something buried. One figure stepped forward, its face still obscured, and a voice, deep and cold, whispered to him, "The darkness has always been inside you." Jamie's eyes snapped open, but the figures remained, lingering at the edges of his vision even as he returned home. Exhaustion weighed down his limbs, but he couldn't sleep. The hallucinations followed him, their whispers echoing in his ears even as he lay in bed. As he pulled the covers up, he felt a strange sensation on his skin. Glancing down, his breath caught in his throat. The symbols, the same cryptic markings from the church, were faintly glowing on his arms. He rubbed at them, but they didn't fade. Instead, they seemed to burn, searing into his flesh like a brand. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting and writhing like living things, and the same cloaked figure appeared at the foot of his bed, its eyeless face turned toward him. Jamie's breath quickened. He closed his eyes, desperate to shut it all out, but Alan's voice came to him, calm and steady in the chaos. "Trust the process, Jamie. It's all part of your purification." The words brought a small, twisted comfort. Jamie's fear ebbed, replaced by a resignation he didn't fully understand. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling, and called Alan. "I saw them," Jamie whispered into the phone. "I saw the shadows." "Good," Alan replied, his voice filled with quiet approval. "You're on the right path. The third ritual will reveal the truth behind your curse." Jamie hung up, his heart heavy but resolved. He would go back. He had to. There was no turning back now. Jamie woke with a start, the weight of the medallion around his neck pressing into his chest like a heavy stone. The air in his apartment felt thick, oppressive. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He sat up, his body aching, and pulled the covers away to inspect his skin. The strange symbols from the previous night had faintly burned into his flesh, though they were hidden beneath his clothes. He rubbed at them, but they didn't fade. A sense of being watched gnawed at him, though the room was empty. Every shadow seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, and every creak of the floorboards sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't escape the feeling that something unseen was lurking, observing, waiting for him to make a move. Jamie tried to go about his morning, reaching for the routines that had once grounded him: coffee, checking his phone, but nothing felt normal anymore. His phone was filled with missed calls from Rebecca, messages filled with worry and desperation. But her words seemed distant, unimportant. The only thing that mattered was the third ritual. The pull of it was overwhelming, a magnetic force that dominated his thoughts. Everything else faded into the background. He knew he should call Rebecca back, but the church's influence was stronger. Alan's promises echoed in his mind, a comforting lull that promised understanding and peace. The next ritual would bring clarity, he told himself. He had to trust the process. With little hesitation, Jamie dressed and prepared to leave, the medallion still heavy around his neck. As he stepped out into the hallway, the shadows seemed to reach for him, pulling him back toward the church. The Church of Eternal Light loomed ahead, its dark spires cutting through the cloudy sky. The moment Jamie stepped inside, he was greeted by the familiar scent of incense and the soft glow of candlelight. The grand foyer seemed even more imposing now, the weight of the previous rituals settling heavily in the air. Alan was there, waiting for him, his smile as warm as ever but his eyes gleaming with something deeper: anticipation. "Jamie," Alan said, stepping forward with outstretched arms. "You've come back. I knew you would." Jamie nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. "I need to keep going. I have to know the truth." "And you will," Alan assured him, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "The third ritual will be your breakthrough. It's time for you to fully embrace the darkness within you." As Alan guided him through the hallways, Jamie noticed the symbols from his visions etched into the stone walls, glowing faintly as they passed. A creeping sense of unease stirred in his chest, but he pushed it down. This was part of the process, he had to believe that. Alan's words held too much power over him now, and the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became. They reached the ritual chamber, but this time, the air felt different, heavier, darker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Alan gestured for Jamie to enter, his smile never faltering. "This will be your most important test yet," Alan said, his voice calm but commanding. "Once you begin, there is no turning back." Jamie stepped into the chamber, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. He swallowed hard, dread creeping up his spine, but with it came anticipation. He needed this. The room was dimly lit, strange runes glowing softly on the floor and walls, casting an eerie light that flickered with each breath Jamie took. The cold air clung to his skin as he moved to the center of the chamber, where a large, glowing symbol awaited him. Alan and several others stood around the perimeter of the room, their eyes focused intently on him. Alan began chanting in a language Jamie couldn't understand, and the others joined in, their voices low and rhythmic, rising and falling like a dark tide. As the chanting grew louder, Jamie's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the presence of the shadowy figures again, this time. They were clearer, more tangible, as if they had been waiting for him. Whispers filled the air, but now Jamie could make out fragments of their speech. "You are the key. The darkness is yours." His breath hitched as one of the figures, a tall, cloaked being without eyes, stepped forward, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. It reached out, its cold, skeletal hand hovering over Jamie's chest. The moment it touched him, Jamie felt a surge of icy cold flood his body, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. A vision struck him: ancient rituals, dark figures gathered around an altar, their voices chanting the same rhythmic pattern he now heard around him. And in the center of it all, a figure that looked like him, standing at the heart of the ritual. But this wasn't a memory. It was something deeper, something older than he could comprehend. The shadowy figure leaned closer, its voice a low hiss. "You were never free. You belong to us." Jamie gasped, his knees buckling beneath him as he collapsed to the ground. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. He looked up to see Alan standing over him, his hand extended in a gesture of reassurance. "This is only the beginning," Alan said softly. "You've touched the truth, Jamie. Now the real transformation can begin." But Jamie couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He had seen something ancient and terrifying, and it had claimed him long before he had ever entered the church. He wasn't free. He never had been. The cold night air hit Jamie's skin as he stumbled out of the church, his mind swirling with the remnants of the ritual. He could still feel the presence of the shadows, watching him, whispering in his ear. His body felt weak, his mind clouded with confusion and fear. As he steadied himself against a nearby lamppost, a familiar voice called out to him. "Jamie." He turned to see Rebecca hurrying toward him, her face etched with concern. She reached out to him, her voice trembling. "Jamie, what's going on? What have they done to you?" Jamie blinked, still dazed. It's fine. I'm fine." But Rebecca wasn't convinced. She grabbed his arm, her eyes searching his face. "No, you're not. I've been doing research on that church. Jamie, it's dangerous. They're manipulating you." Jamie tried to pull away, but her grip tightened. "You don't understand, Rebecca. I'm getting closer to the truth. They're helping me." "Helping you," she repeated, disbelief lacing her words. "Jamie, they're using you. The darkness they're feeding you, it's real. It's not going to save you. It's going to destroy you." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the fog in his mind, but the pull of the church was stronger. Alan's promises were louder. Jamie shook his head, trying to clear the doubt. I need to go back." Rebecca's voice softened, her grip loosening slightly. "Jamie, please. They're not saving you. They're using you." For a moment, Jamie hesitated, her words sinking in. But the pull of the church, the ritual, was too strong. Without another word, he pulled away from her, his footsteps quickening as he walked away, her final plea echoing in his mind. Jamie returned to his apartment late that night, the exhaustion from the ritual settling into his bones. The apartment was dark, oppressive, and the weight of the medallion around his neck felt heavier than before. He pulled it off, holding it in his hand for the first time since Alan had given it to him. As he turned it over in his palm, the symbols on its surface began to glow faintly, pulsing with a cold, unnatural light. Jamie's heart raced as the glow intensified, and suddenly, the medallion seemed to come alive in his hands. Memories that weren't his own flooded his mind, visions of ancient rituals, dark figures chanting in the shadows, and an altar where a man who looked exactly like him stood at the center. The medallion was the key, a connection to something far older and darker than Jamie had ever imagined. The truth struck him like a lightning bolt. The church hadn't placed the darkness inside him. It had always been there, waiting, lurking beneath the surface. The rituals weren't freeing him, they were awakening the ancient being that had been part of him all along. Jamie dropped the medallion, his hands shaking, as the visions faded. He stared at the medallion, his chest tightening with the realization that his fate had already been sealed. The darkness wasn't something he could escape. It was inside him. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast eerie shadows across Jamie's apartment. The medallion lay on the floor, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. Jamie paced back and forth, his mind racing with the visions that had overwhelmed him just moments ago. He couldn't shake the horror of what he had seen, the darkness inside him, the truth that the church's rituals weren't freeing him but awakening something ancient and powerful. He ran a hand through his hair, tugging at it in frustration. The air in the apartment felt thick, suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside felt like the darkness was creeping closer, closing in on him. The medallion sat there, mocking him, reminding him that this wasn't something he could run from. His phone buzzed again, vibrating against the table. Rebecca. Another message, another unanswered call. He wanted to talk to her, to reach out, but what could he say? How could he explain the feeling of something ancient stirring inside him, the pull to give in to the dark force that was slowly consuming him? Jamie caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, his face pale and drawn. For a moment, something else stared back at him, an eyeless figure, grinning darkly, the same shadowy presence from the rituals. He stumbled back, his heart racing. It was inside him. It had always been there. There was no escaping it. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. Jamie grabbed his jacket, his mind made up. He had to confront Alan. The Church of Eternal Light felt different this time. As Jamie pushed open the heavy doors, the familiar scent of incense and the warm glow of candles were still there, but something had changed. The air was colder, thicker with something unseen. The once soothing atmosphere now sickened him, and the weight of the rituals pressed down on his chest with every step he took. He stormed through the foyer, his eyes set on the darkened hallway that led to Alan's office. His mind was racing with questions, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to know the truth. He had to know what the church had really done to him. Alan was waiting for him, as if he had known Jamie would come. He sat behind his lavish desk, a calm smile on his face, but there was something darker in his eyes, something Jamie hadn't seen before. "Jamie," Alan greeted him, his voice as smooth and comforting as ever. "I'm glad you're here." Jamie didn't waste time. "What are you doing to me?" His voice trembled with a mixture of fear and anger. "The visions, the rituals. What are they really for?" Alan stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back as he approached. "You've always been destined for something greater, Jamie. The rituals are not about saving you, they're about preparing you. You are the key to something ancient, something powerful. The darkness you've felt your whole life, it was never a curse. It's who you are." Jamie took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. "What are you talking about?" Alan's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "You are the reincarnation of an ancient being, Jamie. The church has been waiting centuries for you to awaken. The rituals are simply unlocking the power that's always been inside you. You were never meant to be saved. You were meant to ascend." Jamie's world shattered. The medallion, the visions, the pull he felt toward the church, it all made sense now, and it horrified him. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't being saved. He was the dark force the church had been waiting for. "No," Jamie whispered, shaking his head. "That's not true." Alan stepped closer, his voice soft but commanding. "It is true. You can't fight it, Jamie. This is who you were meant to be. Your ascension is inevitable. If you resist, you will only suffer." The words echoed in Jamie's mind, and for a moment, the pull of the darkness inside him grew stronger. But he couldn't accept it, not yet. Panic surged through him, and without another word, Jamie turned and fled the church, Alan's voice calling after him. Jamie ran through the dark streets, his mind reeling with the truth Alan had revealed. The cold night air stung his face, but it did nothing to clear the fog of confusion and fear that clouded his thoughts. By the time he reached Rebecca's apartment, he was out of breath, his heart racing. He knocked on her door, frantic. When she opened it, relief washed over her face, but it quickly faded as she saw the look of terror in his eyes. "Jamie, what's going on?" she asked, pulling him inside. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jamie collapsed onto the couch, his hands trembling. "It's worse than I thought," he said, his voice shaky. "The church. Alan. They've been using me. I'm not being saved, Rebecca. I'm being awakened." Rebecca's eyes widened in horror. "What do you mean?" Jamie explained everything, the rituals, the visions, the revelation that he was the reincarnation of an ancient being the church had been waiting centuries to awaken. As the words spilled out, Rebecca's face paled. "They're using you as a vessel," she whispered, horrified. "I've been researching the church, Jamie. They've done this before, used people to summon dark entities. But I didn't realize it was this big." Jamie buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm losing control. The darkness, it's inside me, Rebecca. I can't stop it." Rebecca knelt in front of him, gripping his hands tightly. "There has to be a way to stop this. There has to be a way to sever the connection before it's too late." Jamie looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. But before Rebecca could say another word, a powerful knock rattled the door. They both froze. Rebecca slowly rose to her feet, her eyes wide with fear. She moved to the window and peeked through the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. "Jamie," she whispered. "They're here." Jamie joined her at the window, his heart sinking as he saw the figures standing outside. Several of the church's followers, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, stood in the rain, their heads bowed as they chanted softly in the same language Jamie had heard during the rituals. Their voices carried through the storm, ominous and rhythmic, sending chills down Jamie's spine. He felt the darkness inside him stir, responding to the presence of the followers, as though the entity within him was eager to join them. "We have to go," Jamie said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." Rebecca nodded, her face pale. Together, they barricaded the door, but they both knew it wouldn't hold for long. The chanting outside grew louder, more insistent, and the followers began to move toward the door, their footsteps slow and deliberate. "We have to get out of here," Jamie said, panic rising in his chest. But deep down, he could feel the entity inside him pulling him toward the church, toward the final ritual. The rain poured down in sheets as Jamie and Rebecca ran through the dark, deserted streets. The church's followers were close behind, their chants growing louder, the shadows twisting unnaturally around them. Jamie's vision blurred as the darkness inside him continued to grow, clouding his mind, warping his perception of reality. The symbols on his skin burned with increasing intensity, as though the entity inside him was fighting to break free. Every step felt like a battle, his body pulled in two directions, toward escape, and toward the church. Rebecca clutched a small notebook filled with her research, her eyes filled with determination. She was desperate to find a way to save him, but Jamie could feel the power inside him growing stronger, pushing him closer to the edge. "We have to keep moving," Rebecca urged, her voice breathless. But Jamie's legs felt heavy, his mind clouded with the pull of the dark force inside him. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Jamie's body gave out. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the rain soaking through his clothes. His vision blurred, and he could hear Alan's voice in his mind, calm and commanding. "Come back, Jamie. It's time." Rebecca knelt beside him, panic in her eyes. "Jamie, get up." But Jamie couldn't move. The darkness was taking hold, pulling him deeper. He was losing the fight. Alan's voice echoed through his mind one last time. "Resistance is futile." And with those words, Jamie's world went black. Jamie's body convulsed violently on the wet pavement, his skin slick with rain and sweat as he writhed under the stormy sky. The dark symbols on his arms and chest glowed fiercely, burning with a heat that seared him from the inside. His vision blurred, flashing between the present and terrifying, ancient visions. Shadowy figures loomed in his mind, their eyeless faces watching him with cold indifference. Through the pounding rain, he could hear Alan's voice, smooth and comforting but now laced with power. "Embrace it, Jamie. The pain will end once you accept your true self. You're almost there." The figure from his nightmares, the eyeless, grinning entity, began to form within him. Jamie could feel it clawing its way to the surface, pulling his humanity down into the depths. His breath came in ragged gasps as the world around him twisted and bent, dark energy rippling through his veins. "Jamie, fight it." Rebecca's voice cut through the haze. She knelt beside him, frantically trying to pull him to his feet, but his body was too far gone, too weak to resist the pull of the dark force awakening within him. "You have to fight it." Jamie's eyes flickered between two worlds, the dark, ancient visions of rituals and altars, and the real world, where Rebecca clung to him desperately. His human self was slipping away, and the entity inside him was waking. "I have to stop it," Jamie muttered, his voice strained, his mind barely holding on. "We have to get back to the church. It's the only way." Rebecca hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes, but she nodded. Together, they stumbled through the rain, the shadow of the ancient entity chasing them as they headed toward the Church of Eternal Light for one final confrontation. The church loomed ahead, its dark spires piercing the stormy sky. Lightning flashed above, illuminating the stone building as Jamie and Rebecca arrived at its doors. The once familiar warmth of the incense and candlelight was gone. Now, the church felt cold, oppressive, as though the building itself was alive with the dark energy it had harbored for centuries. The heavy wooden doors were wide open, as if expecting them. Jamie staggered forward, the symbols on his skin pulsing in time with the faint, rhythmic chanting coming from inside. Rebecca followed closely, her face pale with fear. They stepped into the foyer, and the scent of incense mixed with something sour filled the air. The walls seemed to close in, pulsing with the same symbols that marked Jamie's skin. Inside the ritual chamber, The followers of the church stood in a circle around the altar, their heads bowed as they chanted in unison. Alan stood at the center, his eyes gleaming with anticipation as he looked toward Jamie. "Welcome back, Jamie," Alan said, his voice carrying over the low chanting. "I've been waiting for this moment. Your true ascension is upon us." The shadows in the room shifted, figures moving within the walls, watching. The same dark presence Jamie had seen in his visions now seemed to pulse within the very stone of the church. This place wasn't a sanctuary. It was a temple of darkness. Jamie hesitated, feeling the pull of the altar, the dark energy calling to him. His body, racked with pain and exhaustion, wanted to give in. But as he took a step forward, Rebecca grabbed his arm, her grip tight and desperate. "Don't do this, Jamie. You can still stop it," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Jamie's heart pounded in his chest, torn between the ancient power calling to him and Rebecca's plea. He wanted to fight it, but the pull was too strong. Alan stepped forward, his eyes locked on Jamie. "This is your moment. You were born for this," he said softly, his voice soothing but filled with dark intent. "Once you step onto the altar, the entity inside you will be fully awakened. You will become something far greater than you could ever imagine." The chanting grew louder, the shadowy figures now circling the room, their eyeless faces fixed on Jamie. The air hummed with energy, thick and suffocating. Jamie felt the darkness inside him surge, ready to take full control. His mind was no longer his own, it was slipping further into the depths of the ancient force that had lain dormant for so long. Alan smiled. "You are the key. Step forward, and become who you were meant to be." Jamie's feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the altar. The shadows loomed closer, the chanting reaching a fevered pitch. He could feel the entity's presence taking hold, his body no longer entirely his. Rebecca's scream tore through the chamber. "Jamie, don't." But Jamie's voice, when it came, was no longer his. It was deeper, colder, filled with the malice of the ancient being awakening inside him. "I am here." Jamie stood on the altar, his body glowing with the same dark symbols that pulsed through the walls of the chamber. The entity inside him surged, ready to break free, its power overwhelming. Rebecca's pleas were a distant echo, drowned out by the growing darkness within him. But somewhere, deep beneath the surface, a faint echo of Jamie's own voice whispered, "I am still here." In that moment, Jamie hesitated. The darkness within him writhed, desperate to take full control, but something in Rebecca's voice, something in the memory of who he once was, held him back. "Jamie, fight it." Rebecca's voice was desperate, filled with fear and hope all at once. "You're still in there. I know you are." Jamie's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the darkness receded. He could see the life he had before, the person he had been before the church. With the last shred of his willpower, Jamie took a step back from the altar, refusing to let the entity fully consume him. The chanting faltered, and the shadowy figures hissed in rage, their forms flickering violently. As Jamie stepped away from the altar, the entire ritual chamber began to shake. The walls trembled, and the shadowy figures screamed in fury, their eyeless faces twisting in agony. The symbols on the walls flickered, their power unraveling as the ritual collapsed around them. Alan's calm demeanor shattered. "You fool," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You were meant to ascend. You were the chosen one." The chanting of the followers faltered, and the darkness inside Jamie lashed out, desperate to complete the ascension. But Jamie fought it, forcing the entity back into the depths of his mind. His body ached, his mind strained, but he refused to give in. The power of the ritual crumbled. The shadowy figures dissolved into the walls, vanishing into the void, their voices fading into the darkness. The church, once filled with dark energy, was falling apart. Jamie stumbled back, his body weak but still his own. Dawn broke over the city as Jamie and Rebecca sat on a bench in a quiet park, the ruins of the church far behind them. Jamie's body was drained, his mind exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of peace. The symbols on his skin had faded, but a faint darkness still lingered within him, a reminder that the entity had not been fully vanquished. Rebecca sat beside him, her face filled with quiet relief but also caution. She knew the battle was not over. The darkness inside Jamie still existed, waiting for its chance to return. They shared a moment of silence as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. Jamie looked at Rebecca, grateful that she had stayed with him through it all. But the shadow of what had happened would follow them both for the rest of their lives. Without a word, they stood and walked away from the park, leaving behind the ruins of the church, but carrying with them the weight of the darkness that still lingered. Inside the ruins of the Church of Eternal Light, Alan stood before the crumbled altar, a smile curling on his lips. Though Jamie had resisted, Alan knew the truth. The ancient entity had been awakened, if only partially. He whispered into the darkness, his voice soft but filled with promise. "He will return. They always do." The shadowy figures in the corners of the ruined church stirred, their eyeless faces watching, waiting. The darkness was far from over.